The sky above Mercer's field burned like iron. In that endless heat nothing dared to move, not the crows, not the horses, not even the wind. Only one man walked through the shimmering haze, a dark silhouette dragging a wooden cross behind him, its edge cutting a trail through the dust. From the porch, Jonathan Mercer watched him in silence, his hand trembling on the rifle. He didn't yet know that by the time the sun went down, his family's name would be carved into the earth forever. The sun had not yet climbed above the ridge, yet the air already shimmered with heat. Mercer's field spread wide and pale, a quilt of dust and dying cotton. Every stalk leaned toward the earth as if begging for mercy. Cicadas screamed from the trees. A horse kicked its stall in the barn, restless and thirsty. Somewhere in that silence between heartbeats and wind, a man worked the soil alone. His name was Silas. The handle of the plow cut deep into his palms, but he didn't flinch. Sweat carved silver lines down his dark back. He moved like someone born from the earth itself, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Above him, a buzzard circled once, lazy and sure of death. From the porch, Jonathan Mercer watched. He leaned on the post, hat low, a glass of water forgotten beside him. The land was his father's before him. And yet lately, when he looked out across the field, he couldn't shake the feeling that it no longer obeyed him. That someone else held its pulse. Margaret appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You should eat before it spoils," she said. Jonathan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the far side of the field, where Silas's silhouette bent and straightened in a rhythm that felt too steady, too sure. A man who used to bow his head now moved like he owned the horizon. "Something wrong?" Margaret asked softly. He exhaled. "No, just thinking." But the word thinking sounded too mild for what crawled inside him, something between guilt and fear, though he would never name it. Inside the house, Thomas, their 15-year-old son, sat sharpening a pocket knife. He liked to watch the blade catch the light, to imagine himself a man. At the window, his little sister Grace pressed her face to the glass. "Ma," she whispered, "why don't Mr. Silas ever smile?" Margaret paused at the stove. "Maybe he's got nothing to smile about," Grace frowned. "Then why he stay here?" Before Margaret could answer, thunder grumbled somewhere far off, not from the sky but from the direction of the field. The plow had hit a buried root, a sound like wood breaking bone. Silas stopped, stared at the cracked soil, and for a moment simply stood there breathing. Jonathan watched him from the porch, uneasy. It wasn't the sound that bothered him, it was the stillness that followed. The kind of silence that comes before something changes forever. That evening the heat refused to die. The walls of the house held it like a furnace. Flies gathered on the rim of the lamp, drawn to the light and dying there. Dinner sat heavy on the table. Cornbread, beans, the smell of grease and salt. Silas ate outside on the steps. It had been that way for months now. His choice, or maybe Jonathan's silence, had made it one. Thomas could see him through the screen door, sitting motionless, the twilight painting his face in amber and shadow. "Pa," Thomas said quietly, "he scares Grace." Jonathan set his fork down. "He works hard. That's all that matters." "But sometimes," the boy continued, "I catch him looking at her. Not mean, just like he's remembering something." Margaret's hand trembled as she poured water. "Stop talking nonsense at the table." Outside, Silas hummed, low, steady, a melody older than the soil itself. It drifted through the screen like smoke. Grace covered her ears. "I don't like it, Ma." Margaret forced a smile. "It's just a song, darling." But even she couldn't finish her meal. Night came thick and breathless. Jonathan stepped onto the porch, a lantern in hand. Across the field, fireflies blinked like tiny spirits. The plow stood abandoned in the dirt, the broken root beside it pale as bone. He took a sip of whiskey and listened. The hum again, farther this time, near the old well. He lifted the lantern, squinting. For an instant, he thought he saw someone kneeling there. When he called out, the shape melted into darkness. Silas, no answer, only the low murmur of water and crickets. Jonathan stayed a moment longer, then spat into the dust and went inside. Behind him, unseen, the figure rose again and whispered something into the wind, words not meant for white men to hear. At dawn, Margaret found footprints by the kitchen door, large, bare, smeared with mud. They led nowhere. She said nothing to Jonathan, only wiped them away with a wet rag, whispering a prayer under her breath. Grace followed her, curious. "What are you doing, Ma?" "Cleaning," Margaret replied too quickly. But later, when she went to hang laundry, she saw Silas at the far edge of the field, carving something into a piece of wood. Each strike of his knife echoed across the heat. She squinted. It looked like a small cross. That afternoon, Grace wandered outside with her doll, a crude rag figure Silas had once repaired for her, sewing the arm back on with quiet patience. She carried it proudly, swinging it by the hair, until she tripped near the old fence and the doll's head tore loose. She gasped. Before she could cry, a shadow fell over her. Silas stood there, holding the wooden cross. "You should be careful where you walk." "Miss Grace," he said, voice soft but strange. "I broke it," she whispered. He knelt, picked up the doll's head, brushed off the dirt, and pressed it back onto the body. "There," he said. "She's fixed again." But as he handed it to her, Grace saw his eyes, wet, distant, as though he wasn't looking at her at all, but through her, at something buried deep in the past. When Margaret came running, Silas was already walking away, the small cross still in his hand. That night, the wind finally came, but it carried no coolness, only dust. The shutters rattled. Margaret prayed by candlelight, whispering verses until her lips went numb. Jonathan sat with his rifle across his knees, listening to the boards creak. Thomas dreamed of footsteps on the porch. Grace dreamed of water, deep and black, and a voice humming beneath it. When morning broke, they found the wooden cross standing in the center of the field. No one had seen Silas place it there. At its base lay a dead crow, wings spread wide like a sacrifice. Jonathan stared at it for a long time. "To take it down," he ordered. Silas didn't move. "It stays," he said quietly. "It marks something." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It marks my land." Silas's eyes lifted, steady, unblinking. "Land remembers, sir, even when men forget." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Only the field breathed between them. The same earth that had once held chains and bones, now holding secrets they both feared to name. That evening, thunder rolled in the distance again. The sky bruised purple, heavy with promise. Grace watched from the window as Silas stood beneath the cross, arms raised slightly, whispering words she couldn't hear. Jonathan loaded his rifle. Margaret clutched his sleeve. "Please don't," he pulled away. "If a man wants to worship the devil on my land, I'll send him to meet him." He stepped outside, the air thick with the smell of rain. Lightning cracked, briefly turning Silas into a white-hot silhouette against the dark. Then the storm broke, and the world vanished in water and sound. From inside the house, Grace screamed. The lamp shattered. Margaret called Jonathan's name, but her voice drowned beneath the wind. Outside, the field came alive, rows of cotton thrashing like ghosts in the storm. Jonathan stumbled through them, lantern gone, rifle slick in his hands. He shouted Silas's name, but the thunder answered instead. When the flash came again, he saw the cross, empty. And beside it, 2 sets of footprints leading toward the river. By dawn, the storm had passed. The field steamed under the returning sun, and the world smelled of wet ash. Margaret found Jonathan sitting on the porch, his clothes soaked, his eyes hollow. Grace slept in her arms, alive, her skin cold but unmarked. Silas was gone. Jonathan didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "He pulled her from the river. Saved her." Margaret nodded. "Then where is he?" Jonathan stared at the field. "Maybe the land took him back." The words hung there, heavy and final. Behind them, the cross still stood, its shadow long and straight, pointing toward the rising sun. And somewhere beneath that burning light, the soil whispered a name no one would ever hear again. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. The smell of wet wood, the taste of iron in the air, the silence that followed too completely. No birds sang. No horses called from the barn. The Mercer house stood half-drowned in morning mist, its porch steps slick and glistening like the scales of a snake. Inside, Margaret wiped the table again and again, though it was already clean. Her hands moved without thought. She simply needed to hear something, any sound besides that suffocating quiet. Grace sat near the hearth, wrapped in a quilt, her hair still damp. She hadn't spoken since the river. Jonathan lingered by the window. His shirt clung to his shoulders, and his rifle leaned beside the door. He looked out toward the field, where the wooden cross still stood unbroken, the only mark of the night that refused to fade. "Did you find him?" Margaret asked finally. Jonathan shook his head. Not a trace. No footprints after the river. No torn cloth, nothing. Maybe he went into town. No, Jonathan said almost to himself. He wouldn't. He turned away from the glass. The light caught his face in pieces, one half in shadow, one half gold. For the first time in years he looked older than his age. By afternoon the heat had returned. The air pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. Jonathan tried to work, repaired the fence, checked the horses, but the land felt strange beneath his boots. Every sound, even his own footsteps, seemed louder than it should be. Thomas helped for a while, but the boy's eyes kept drifting to the riverbank. "You think he drowned, Pa?" he asked. Jonathan didn't answer. He only said, "Men like him don't die easy." When the sun reached its peak, they returned home. The air inside was thick with the smell of stew. Margaret had cooked too much. It was her way of holding the family together, of pretending the world hadn't changed overnight. Grace watched her mother silently, clutching her doll. The ragged stitches along the doll's neck looked newer now, the thread darker than before, almost red. At dusk, the family gathered for supper. Margaret had lit the oil lamp early. Its glow was pale and flickering, painting long shadows across the table. The plates steamed, the silverware gleamed, but no one moved to eat. Jonathan sat at the head, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the empty chair by the door, Silas's chair. For months the man had eaten outside, but now the space itself felt wrong, like an unfinished sentence. Thomas cleared his throat. "Maybe we should—" "Say grace," Margaret interrupted quickly, voice trembling. They bowed their heads. Margaret began the prayer, but halfway through Grace spoke softly. "Shouldn't we pray for him too?" Her parents froze. "For Mr. Silas," she added. "He saved me." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Eat your food, Grace." "But—" "I said eat." The words hit like a slap. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand, but the child pulled away. Tears welled, silent and shimmering. Outside, the wind stirred the shutters. Something knocked once, wood against wood, and then nothing. As the meal went on, conversation died. Only the clatter of spoons and the ticking of the wall clock filled the air. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards, came a faint sound. Tap, tap, tap. Margaret glanced at Jonathan. He frowned, listening. The rhythm was too even to be a mouse, too deliberate. "Probably the pipes," he muttered. Though there were none, Grace whispered. "He's under the house." Grace. Margaret snapped, but her voice cracked. Jonathan rose from his chair. He grabbed the lantern and stepped outside without a word. The yard was drowned in darkness. He circled to the crawl space beneath the kitchen. The storm had washed away the dust, leaving the ground soft and black. He knelt, lifted the loose board and held the lantern low, only silence. And yet, there in the far corner, something glinted faintly. He crawled closer. It was a small carving, half buried in mud. A wooden figure shaped like a man with arms raised, mouth open. The face had been burned. Jonathan recoiled. His breath caught heavy and fast. Behind him he heard the door creak. "Jonathan!" Margaret's voice barely above a whisper. He stood, covering the hole again. "Just rats," he lied. But when they went back inside, Grace was no longer at the table. They found her outside, standing in the middle of the field. The lantern light barely reached her. She was staring up at the wooden cross. "Grace!" Margaret called, running barefoot through the dust. The child didn't move. When they reached her, they saw why. At the base of the cross lay another carving, freshly placed. A small wooden doll, identical to Grace's, its head missing. Jonathan's stomach turned. Who did this? But Grace only whispered, "He's not gone. Pa, he's waiting." The wind shifted, carrying a smell neither of them could name. Wet ashes? Or maybe something older. Jonathan grabbed the doll and flung it into the dark. "Enough of this nonsense. We're done with ghosts." He carried Grace back to the house. But behind him, Margaret looked once more at the cross and swore she saw it sway, just slightly, as if breathing. That night no one slept. Thomas lay awake in the attic, knife in hand. Margaret prayed in whispers until her voice failed. Jonathan sat by the door, rifle loaded, eyes fixed on the window. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow. Its light turned the world to ash. At midnight the front gate creaked open. Jonathan stiffened. He heard it again, wood dragging on soil, slow, scraping. He raised the rifle and moved toward the porch. A shape stood beyond the fence, human, barefoot, head bowed. Jonathan's finger tightened on the trigger. Silas, he breathed, but when lightning flashed, the figure was gone. Only the empty field stared back. Morning found him still on the porch, the rifle heavy in his lap, the barrel slick with dew. Margaret came out quietly and set a cup of coffee beside him. Neither spoke. The sun rose indifferent. By the barn, Thomas shouted, "Pa, you need to see this." They ran to him. On the barn door, carved deep into the wood, were words, "The river remembers." Beneath the carving hung a single feather, black and wet, pinned by a nail. Margaret covered her mouth. "Oh, Lord." Jonathan's face was stone. "Get the children inside." But as she turned, Grace was already standing behind her, staring at the words. Her lips moved soundlessly, repeating them like a prayer. That evening they locked every window. No one spoke during supper. The stew turned cold. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to light the lamp, but the wick refused to catch. Jonathan finally rose, struck a match and froze, because in that instant of flame he saw something behind the glass of the window. A face. Silas's face, wet, pale, eyes open and empty. The match dropped from Jonathan's hand. The lamp shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. Grace screamed. Thomas grabbed her, pulling her toward the stairs. Margaret called for Jonathan, but he was already outside, barefoot, running toward the field. Rain began again, thin at first, then harder. Through the downpour he saw the cross, still there, still upright. But now nailed to it was the doll, the same doll he had thrown away. And beneath it, in the mud, the shape of a man's footprints leading back to the river. Jonathan stood there until the storm drowned the lantern. When he returned inside, Margaret sat on the floor, clutching Grace. Thomas watched from the stairs. No one spoke. At last, Jonathan said quietly, "We're leaving tomorrow." "Where?" Margaret asked. "Anywhere but here." He looked at the field one last time through the open door. The cross still stood, but as lightning flashed, for a single heartbeat, it wasn't wood he saw. It was a man standing there, arms outstretched, eyes open, as if waiting to be forgiven. Then darkness took him again. Dawn came without color. The clouds hung low over Mercer's land, heavy and unmoving, like a curtain drawn across the sky. The world smelled of damp wood and rust. Somewhere water dripped from the eaves, slow, rhythmic, the sound of time itself leaking away. Inside the house, no one spoke. Margaret poured coffee that no one drank. Jonathan sat at the table, staring at his hands. Beneath the grime and calluses, the tremor in his fingers was new. Grace hummed softly to her doll, the same broken melody Silas used to hum when he worked the fields. Each note twisted the air, fragile as spider silk. Thomas lingered near the window, knife at his belt, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The boy looked older now, older and frightened of something he couldn't name. Jonathan rose finally. "We leave by sundown," he said. His voice carried the weight of command, but not conviction. Margaret didn't look at him. "And if the land doesn't let us?" He turned sharply. "It's dirt, Margaret. Not a living thing." But even as he said it, the boards beneath his feet creaked like they were listening. Outside, the field waited, silent, endless, wrong. The cross still stood in its center, darker now, soaked with nights of rain. At its base, the soil looked freshly turned. Jonathan walked toward it with the rifle slung over his shoulder. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the cross, he saw something new carved into the wood. J.M., 1847, his own initials. The year before Silas had come to the farm, he stepped back, breathing hard. "Who did this?" he whispered. The wind offered no answer, only a faint whisper that might have been his name. Margaret watched from the porch. She saw her husband fall to his knees before the cross, his shoulders shaking as though he were confessing to something. She didn't go to him. Some confessions weren't meant for witnesses. Behind her, Grace tugged at her skirt. "Ma," she said softly, "Mr. Silas isn't gone." Margaret knelt. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Grace pointed toward the well. "I heard him. He was singing." Margaret froze. The well sat 50 yards from the house, half hidden by weeds. For years no one had used it. The rope had snapped, the bucket lost to the dark below. "Stay inside," she said, her voice barely holding steady. The air near the well was cooler. Margaret leaned over the stone rim, peering down into the black. Nothing, only her own reflection wavering on the surface of the water. Then, faintly, the ripple of movement. And a sound, soft, distant, familiar. A voice humming the same slow tune Grace had been singing. Her breath caught. "Silas," she whispered. The humming stopped. Something splashed once, then silence returned, complete and cruel. She stumbled back, heart racing, skirt dragging in the mud. Behind her, a crow cried once and flew off toward the field. That evening, Jonathan called his son to the barn. Thomas found him standing near the old trunk his grandfather had built, the one that smelled of oil and dust. "Close the door," Jonathan said. Inside, the lamplight flickered over tools, ropes, and boxes. Jonathan lifted the lid of the trunk and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. When he opened it, Thomas saw an old revolver wrapped in oil-stained rags, and beneath it a folded letter. "I need you to read this," Jonathan said quietly. The paper was brittle, yellowed. Thomas read the first lines aloud. March 4, 1847. "Mr. Jonathan Mercer is hereby granted authority to assist in the retrieval of escaped property belonging to the West Creek plantation." Thomas looked up, confused. "Property?" Jonathan's eyes dropped. "Men, women, slaves." The boy's throat tightened. "You were—" "I was young and stupid. I did what they told me." Silas's family was among them. He took the paper, staring at the faded ink. "I told myself it was the law. I told myself it wasn't my fault." Outside, thunder murmured in the distance. "But it was," Jonathan said. "When we found them, there was fire, screaming. His wife, his little girl." He stopped, voice breaking. "She drowned in that same river." Thomas couldn't speak. For the first time, he saw his father not as a man, but as something smaller, a creature hollowed out by guilt. Jonathan folded the letter again. "Now you know why he came here. Why he stayed." By nightfall, the air grew thick again, heavy with storm. Margaret sat on the porch, a lantern beside her, the Bible open on her lap but unread. In the field, the cross gleamed faintly with each flash of lightning. Grace slept upstairs, clutching her doll. Thomas paced the hall, unable to rest. Then through the hum of rain they heard it again, singing. Low, close, coming from beneath the floor. Margaret's hands went cold. "Jonathan!" He already had the rifle. They tore up the boards near the hearth. Beneath the house, the earth was damp and dark. Something moved there, slow, deliberate. Jonathan lowered the lantern. The light caught a face, Silas, but not alive, not breathing. His skin pale, eyes half open, mouth twisted as if caught mid-word. Margaret screamed. Jonathan dropped to his knees, shaking. No, that's not—" The lantern flickered. Silas's body was gone. Only the shape of him remained in the mud, pressed deep like an imprint. Rain hammered the roof. They flared outside, desperate for air, but the storm swallowed them. The field glowed white with lightning, and in its center the cross now burned. Flames rose silently, orange against the black sky. The wood did not crumble. It stood tall, unyielding, the fire wrapping it like a halo. Grace appeared in the doorway, barefoot, eyes wide. "He's calling," she said. Margaret grabbed her, but the child pointed to the fire. "He says it's not done." Jonathan stepped into the rain, rifle in hand. "Enough!" he shouted at the storm. "You want forgiveness? Take me." The thunder answered, rolling over the land like laughter. When dawn came, the field was ash. Only the cross remained, unburned, blackened but whole. At its base lay the revolver and the letter, soaked but legible. Jonathan stood over them, hollow-eyed. He dropped to his knees and began to dig. Margaret tried to stop him, but he kept digging, bare hands tearing through the mud until they struck wood. A box, old heavy. Inside were bones, small ones. A child's. Wrapped in cloth marked with the initials SM. Margaret covered her mouth, sobbing. Jonathan stared into the box, rain washing the mud from his face. "Silas Mercer," he whispered. She took his name. For the first time he understood. The cross wasn't a warning. It was a grave. He buried the bones properly that day beneath the oak near the river. Grace placed her doll on top, whispering, "Sleep now." When the last shovel of dirt fell, the sky broke open, light spilling through the clouds for the first time in days. The river glittered like glass. Jonathan stood there a long while, hat in hand. Margaret came beside him, her fingers finding his. "What now?" she asked. He looked at the field. "It's over," he said. But somewhere behind them, in the whisper of wind through the trees, a voice hummed, soft, low, endless. The wind began before the clouds came. It moved low across Mercer's land, carrying the smell of river water and ash. By evening, the sky had turned the color of steel, and the air was charged, electric, trembling with something that felt almost alive. Jonathan stood on the porch, watching the horizon fold into itself. The field looked smaller somehow, shrunken under the weight of the storm. He could see the cross even from here, black, motionless, waiting. Margaret came to the door, her voice trembling. "They said on the radio the bridge is gone. If we're leaving, it has to be tonight." Jonathan didn't answer. He wasn't listening to her voice, but to the wind, to the strange cadence in it, almost like words. Every gust seemed to whisper his name. He gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. "It's not the bridge that's keeping us here." Inside, Grace sat by the window, her doll cradled in her arms. She was talking softly, not to herself but as though answering someone. Thomas watched from the corner. "Who are you talking to, Gracie?" She didn't look at him. "He says the river's coming back." Thomas's stomach turned cold. "Don't say that." She blinked, slow, like in a dream. "He says Pa has to listen or it'll take everything." Her voice had changed and lower, distant, not her own. Thomas took a step closer, but she suddenly looked up at him, eyes wide and glassy. "He's right behind you." Thomas spun around. Nothing, only the empty hall, the flicker of light from the kerosene lamp. When he turned back, Grace was standing, her doll hanging limp at her side. By nightfall, thunder rolled like artillery across the fields. Rain struck the roof in wild sheets. The air hummed with static. Jonathan gathered what he could, blankets, food, the rifle, but his hands kept shaking. Margaret followed him from room to room, trying to make him stop, to look at her, to remember who they were. "You can't fight ghosts, John," she said. He stopped, jaw clenched. "Then tell me what I'm supposed to do. Let them take us?" Her eyes softened. "Maybe they already have." Lightning flashed, spilling white light through the window. For one heartbeat, they both saw a shadow at the edge of the field. A man's silhouette standing beside the cross. The storm hit full. The house shuddered as wind tore at the shutters, rain poured through cracks in the roof, and thunder crawled down the chimney. Jonathan lit the lanterns and loaded the rifle. Thomas stayed by the stairs with Grace, trying to calm her shaking. Margaret prayed aloud now, her voice rising and falling with the wind. Then the lights went out. A crack like the world splitting open shook the house. The front door slammed wide, and in the doorway stood Silas. He was drenched, head bowed, clothes plastered to his skin. Water ran from his hands like blood. But his eyes, those eyes, they weren't human anymore. They were hollow, endless, lit by something deep and terrible. Margaret screamed. Jonathan raised the rifle, but his hands faltered. The lantern's glow caught Silas's face, and for the first time Jonathan saw no hatred there, only grief. "You left her," Silas said quietly. His voice was barely audible over the storm. "You let her drown." Jonathan's throat tightened. "It was an accident." Silas took a step forward, leaving wet footprints on the floorboards. "She called for you," he said. "She called your name. I didn't know." "You knew," Silas whispered. "You just didn't care." Lightning flashed again, and in that split second Silas wasn't alone. Behind him stood shadows, a woman, a child, their faces turned away, their outlines flickering like smoke. Margaret fell to her knees, crossing herself. Grace began to cry, whispering, "Stop it, please stop." Jonathan dropped the rifle. The storm outside roared like the ocean, and for a moment, it was the ocean, the sound of rushing water, the scent of the river. The memory of that night long ago when he'd held a torch and not a hand. He stepped forward, his voice breaking. "If you came for me, then take me. Leave them be." Silas stared at him for a long time. Then slowly he reached out, not in anger but almost tenderly. His hand brushed Jonathan's chest over his heart. The wind stopped. Everything went silent, the rain, the thunder, even the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, as softly as it had come, Silas's image began to fade. Not vanish, but dissolve like mist burned away by dawn. Jonathan fell to his knees. The rifle clattered to the floor. When he looked up again, the doorway was empty. Margaret rushed to him. "John," but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her at the window. Outside, the cross was gone. He stumbled out into the rain. Where the cross had stood, the earth was torn open, a pit deep and black, water swirling at its bottom. Lightning split the sky, and in that blinding flash, Jonathan saw something inside the hole, bones, dozens of them, small, fragile. The flood had come again, but this time from beneath. Thomas ran after him, shouting, "Pa, come back!" But Jonathan didn't stop. He stood at the edge of the pit, rain streaming down his face, mixing with tears. Margaret appeared in the doorway, Grace clinging to her side. Jonathan turned once, his voice breaking. "Tell her I'm sorry." Then the ground gave way beneath him. Thomas screamed as his father vanished into the churning dark. The water swallowed him whole. The storm raged through the night. By dawn the sky was clear again. The field was a lake, the house half broken, the air filled with the smell of wet earth and loss. They searched for Jonathan for hours, but the pit had filled in, leaving nothing but mud. Only the rifle remained, half buried near the edge, and the faint outline of the cross pressed into the ground. Grace stood beside it, silent. When Margaret tried to pull her away, she whispered, "He's not gone, Ma. He's with her now." Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing. That night, for the first time in days, the air was still. Thomas sat on the porch, the broken lantern beside him, watching the fireflies return. Grace slept inside, her doll resting on the windowsill. Margaret sat by the hearth, her hands folded, her eyes open but unfocused. In the distance, faintly, the sound of water moving over stones. The river was calm again, and from the field a voice began to hum, soft, steady, the same tune Silas used to sing under the sun. It rose and fell with the wind, never louder than a heartbeat, never gone entirely. Thomas listened, closing his eyes. He didn't feel fear anymore, only something else, something like peace. When lightning flashed once more on the horizon, it wasn't white, but gold. For just a moment, he thought he saw them all standing there. His father, Silas, the woman, the child, watching over the land. Then they were gone, and the field was only a field again. Morning broke like a slow exhale. The world lay still, wrapped in a thin white fog that softened every edge. The storm had gone, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Trees torn from the ground, shingles scattered across the yard, the field flattened into waves of mud. For the first time in days, the air smelled clean. The sun rose pale and uncertain, filtering through the mist like a hand searching for light. Margaret stepped outside barefoot, the porch cold beneath her feet. Her nightdress clung damp to her legs, her hair undone, her face hollowed by sleeplessness. Every step she took sank softly into the wet earth, leaving shallow prints behind her. At the edge of the field, the remains of the cross lay in splinters, half swallowed by the mud. Jonathan's rifle leaned against it, rusted, streaked with clay, the barrel twisted from the fall. No body. Only the sound of the river somewhere beyond the trees, calm and endless. Margaret stood there for a long time. When the wind moved, the wheat stubble shimmered like water, and she almost thought she could see him. Jonathan, standing knee-deep in that light, his hat low, his shoulders straight again. Then the vision faded, and she was alone. Back at the house, Thomas worked in silence. He had repaired the front door, swept the floor, mended what he could. He moved like a man older than his years, his face drawn, his hands raw from labor. Grace sat by the window, sunlight spilling across her lap. Her doll rested in her arms again, clean and whole, the torn stitches newly sewn. When Thomas passed, she looked up at him. "Pa's not gone," she said softly. He paused, lowering the hammer. "Don't, Gracie. He's with Mr. Silas. They're friends now." Thomas forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "You just dreamt it, that's all." Grace shook her head. "Hay said the river forgave him." Thomas turned away quickly, pretending to fix the hinge on the cabinet door so she wouldn't see the tears forming. The day moved slow, heavy with heat. By noon, Margaret began to gather what little they had left. Clothes, food, a few family pictures saved from the storm. She paused by the mantel, where Jonathan's hat hung on a nail. For a moment she lifted it, fingers tracing the worn brim. Then she placed it back gently, as if setting down a prayer. The Bible lay open on the table. Its pages were warped, the ink blurred by rain, but one verse remained untouched. "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Her lips moved without sound. Maybe she wasn't praying for Jonathan anymore. Maybe she was praying for the land, for everything that had happened on it. Toward evening, the sky turned the color of copper. A faint breeze stirred the cotton stalks that had survived the flood. Grace followed it out to the field, barefoot, her dress brushing the wet grass. At the riverbank, she found a piece of wood, half buried in silt. It was one arm of the old cross, smooth now, stripped of its char. In its center, carved deep, were 3 letters. JMS. She traced them with her finger, smiling faintly. When Thomas called her from the porch, she whispered, "I'll be right back," and set the wood gently into the water. The current caught it, turning it slowly until it drifted downstream, silent, steady, carrying its message wherever the river went. That night the Mercers ate dinner by candlelight. No one spoke. The air buzzed softly with crickets. Somewhere an owl called from the woods. The storm had taken the noise of fear with it. After supper, Margaret stepped onto the porch. The stars had returned, sharp and bright against the dark. For the first time in weeks she could see the moon again, silver and full. She closed her eyes and breathed. In the distance the river murmured, not in anger now but in rhythm like a lullaby. Later, as she prepared for bed, she found Grace asleep on the floor beside the window. The doll was beside her, facing outward, its stitched smile faintly visible in the moonlight. Margaret lifted her gently, laid her on the bed and brushed a curl of hair from her forehead. "Sleep, my love," she whispered. Grace stirred, but didn't wake. Her lips parted slightly and she murmured something, too soft to catch. Margaret leaned closer. "She says thank you," Grace whispered in her dream. Margaret froze. "Who, darling?" But Grace didn't answer. Her breathing slowed, deep and peaceful, the way a child's should. Margaret looked out the window. For just an instant, she saw 2 figures standing by the edge of the field. One tall, one smaller, hand in hand, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Then the fog drifted, and they were gone. At dawn, Thomas packed the wagon. The sun rose warm this time, the kind of light that promised a beginning instead of an ending. Margaret stood by the porch, looking out over what was left of their land. "Will we come back?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No, son, not here. The ground's done with us." Grace climbed onto the seat, clutching her doll. As the wagon creaked forward, she looked back one last time. The field shimmered under the rising sun. And for a moment it looked alive, not haunted, not cursed, just alive. And there, at the far edge near the oak by the river, stood a single wooden cross, new, unburned. No one had built it, and yet it was there. The breeze moved through the branches, and a low humming drifted through the air, that same old tune, familiar and soft, rising and falling like the breath of the earth. Margaret turned her head slightly, eyes closed. It sounded like peace. When the wagon disappeared down the dirt road, the camera of memory lingered on the field, wide, golden, endless. The wind bent the grass in gentle waves. The sun caught the water of the river, turning it into light, and in that light, if one looked closely enough, one could almost see them. The shapes of 2 men standing side by side, their faces lifted to the horizon, one white, one black. No chains, no guns, just silence, and the forgiveness that the earth had been waiting for.